Canyon Walls Echoes. Rosie Monroe had spent years playing the grieving widow, but when Gideon Landry, the deadliest bounty hunter in the West, rode into town, she knew her secrets weren't safe. He stepped onto her porch, his sharp eyes locked onto hers. "You got a lot of folks' skin about you, Rosie," he murmured. "Maybe you ought to tell me why." Chapter 1. The Ghost of Redemption Gulch. The wind, a restless spirit, howled through the skeletal remains of Redemption Gulch, carrying with it the whispers of forgotten sins and the fine, gritty dust that coated everything Rosie Monroe's weathered porch, her calloused hands, her weary soul. It was a town clinging to life by a thread, a place where the sun beat down with merciless intensity, baking the earth and the hopes of its inhabitants to a crisp. Rosie watched it all from the shadowed sanctuary of her porch, a rocking chair her only companion, its rhythmic creak a counterpoint to the mournful symphony of the wind. She was a woman sculpted by hardship, her face a roadmap of loss and resilience. Lines etched around her eyes, the color of faded denim after a long, harsh winter, spoke of sleepless nights and unshed tears. Her hair, once the vibrant gold of a prairie sunflower, was now streaked with silver, pulled back severely from her face, revealing the stubborn set of her jaw, the defiant tilt of her chin. She wore a simple, faded calico dress, its practicality a testament to a life lived without frills or pretense. But beneath the worn fabric, beneath the carefully constructed facade of a grieving widow, lay a secret, a fire that burned hotter than the desert sun. It had been 5 years since they buried Thomas, 5 years since the official story had been etched into the town's collective memory, a tragic accident, a runaway horse, a life cut short. 5 years of playing the role, of accepting the pitying glances, the whispered condolences, the cloying sympathy that choked her like the dust storms that swept through the valley. 5 years of pretending she didn't hear the rumors. 5 years of perfecting a lie. Rosie had learned to live with the ghosts. They danced in the shadows of her small, ramshackle house, whispered in the rustling leaves of the lone cottonwood tree that stood sentinel in her yard, their voices a constant reminder of the life she had lost, the life she had taken. Thomas's ghost was the loudest, of course, a swirling vortex of regret and accusation. She saw him in the flickering lamplight, felt his phantom touch in the chill of the night air, heard his voice in the mournful cry of the coyotes. The town itself was a ghost in the making. Once a bustling hub of activity, fueled by the promise of gold and the relentless optimism of pioneers, Redemption Gulch was now a faded photograph, its colors leached out by time and despair. The saloon, once a raucous den of laughter and vice, stood silent and empty, its windows boarded up, its doors hanging askew. The general store, its shelves once overflowing with provisions, was now a dusty mausoleum of forgotten dreams. Even the church, with its steeple reaching towards a heaven that seemed indifferent to their plight, had lost its luster, its bells silent, its pews empty. The few remaining residents were a hardy, if somewhat broken, bunch. Old Man Hemlock, who ran the livery stable, his hands gnarled and twisted like the ancient juniper trees that clung to the surrounding hills. Martha Jenkins, the baker, whose once cheerful face was now etched with the same weariness that marked Rosie's own. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was as brittle as the parched earth he patrolled, his eyes holding a haunted look that spoke of battles fought and lost. They all knew her story, or at least the version she allowed them to know. They saw her as the grieving widow, a woman consumed by sorrow, clinging to the remnants of a life that had been cruelly snatched away. They offered their sympathy, their awkward attempts at comfort, their unspoken understanding. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know the darkness that lurked beneath the surface, the secret that Rosie guarded with a ferocity born of desperation and a chilling determination. The rhythmic creak of the rocking chair was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching hooves. Rosie's hand, resting on the worn wooden armrest, tightened. She knew that sound, the steady, purposeful rhythm of a horse ridden by a man who knew where he was going, a man who wasn't afraid of the journey. A rider was unusual in these parts, these days. Redemption Gulch was off the beaten path, a forgotten corner of the West. Visitors were rare, and those who did come usually brought trouble. Rosie rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The sun, a fiery orb sinking towards the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the dusty street, making it difficult to discern the rider's features. But as he drew closer, she saw him. Tall and lean, silhouetted against the dying light, he rode with an easy grace that belied the power coiled within him. He was a predator, she knew it instinctively, and Redemption Gulch was his hunting ground. He was coming for her. She'd known this day would arrive. It was only a matter of time. And that time was now. The silence that descended was heavy, thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. The only sound was the soft thud of the horse's hooves and the frantic beat of Rosie's own heart. Chapter 2. Shadows on the Porch. The rider reined in his horse, a magnificent chestnut mare with a coat the color of burnished copper, just outside Rosie's property. Dust billowed around them, momentarily obscuring the man in a swirling cloud of ochre. When it settled, Rosie saw him clearly, and the breath caught in her throat. He was even more imposing up close. He wore a long, dark duster that concealed most of his frame, but she could sense the lean strength beneath it, the dangerous grace of a coiled rattlesnake. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his eyes, when they met hers, were like chips of flint, sharp and unforgiving, glinting with an unsettling intensity. A scar, thin and white, bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a past lived on the edge. He had a gun belt strapped low on his hips, the worn leather and the dull gleam of the Colt Peacemaker a clear indication of his profession. He dismounted with a fluid motion, the movement economical and precise, the spurs on his boots jingling softly in the stillness. He didn't tie the mare. She stood patiently, her head lowered, her ears twitching, as if accustomed to waiting for her master's next command. The man approached the porch slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Rosie's. The porch boards creaked under his weight as he ascended the steps. He stopped a few feet from her, the distance a palpable barrier, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that crackled between them. The scent of him reached her leather, horse sweat, and something else, something wild and untamed, like the scent of the desert after a rare rain. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation of something he already knew. Rosie met his gaze squarely, refusing to be intimidated. She had faced down worse than a gunslinger in her life, and she wouldn't cower now. "That's right," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her. "And you are?" He tilted his head slightly, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gideon Landry," he said, the name spoken like a whispered threat, a promise of trouble to come. "Some folks call me other things, but that'll do for now." Rosie had heard the name, whispered in hushed tones in the darker corners of the West. Gideon Landry. A bounty hunter, a tracker, a man who found what others couldn't, a man who brought justice, or his own version of it, to those who thought they could escape the long arm of the law, or the longer reach of vengeance. He was a legend, a ghost story told around campfires to frighten unruly children, and now he was standing on her porch, his eyes boring into her, seeing through the carefully constructed facade she had spent years perfecting. "What brings you to Redemption Gulch, Mr. Landry?" Rosie asked, her voice deceptively calm. She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. She wanted to see if he would play the game, or if he would cut straight to the chase, lay bare the secrets she had guarded so fiercely. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail, from the worn fabric of her dress to the defiant set of her jaw. "Someone who doesn't want to be found." "And you think that someone is me?" Rosie challenged, her chin lifting slightly. Landry's eyes narrowed, the flint-like intensity hardening. You got a lot of folks' skin about you, Rosie, he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the sound sending a fresh wave of unease through her. Maybe you ought to tell me why. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of the past she had tried so hard to bury. The ghosts stirred, their whispers growing louder, their presence more insistent. Thomas's face, contorted in pain and betrayal, flashed before her eyes. Rosie felt a tremor of fear, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. But she pushed it down, burying it beneath layers of practiced composure. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to be undone now. She would play this game to the end, whatever the cost. She forced a smile that was a challenge and a dismissal to appear on her face. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Landry. I'm just a widow, trying to make a life for myself in this forgotten corner of the world. She gestured with a slight turn of her hand to encompass the dusty and empty main street. The air remained heavy, the promise of an approaching storm crackling in the stillness between them, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic creak of the porch swing swaying gently in the evening breeze. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in dust. Landry studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, searching for any flicker of deceit, any crack in her carefully constructed armor. Rosie held his gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to betray the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had learned to control her emotions, to mask her true feelings, to present a facade of calm indifference to the world. It was a survival skill, honed over years of living a lie. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and laced with a subtle threat. Redemption Gulch, it's a fitting name, wouldn't you say? A place where people come to escape their past, to find redemption, or maybe just to disappear. Rosie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She forced herself to relax, to maintain the illusion of composure. It's a quiet town, Mr. Landry. We don't get many visitors. That's what I hear, he replied, his eyes flicking towards the empty street, the boarded-up buildings, the general air of desolation that hung over Redemption Gulch. A town with secrets. Every town has its secrets, Mr. Landry, Rosie countered, her voice tight.
And its ghosts.
He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down her spine. I'm good at finding ghosts, Mrs. Monroe. And secrets. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant howl of a coyote and the frantic beat of Rosie's heart. She knew she was cornered, trapped in a game of cat and mouse with a man who was clearly a master of his craft. But she wouldn't surrender. She would fight, using every weapon at her disposal, every ounce of cunning and resilience she possessed. What do you want, Mr. Landry? She asked, her voice finally betraying a hint of the desperation she felt. He leaned closer, his presence filling her space, his scent leather, dust, and that unsettling wildness overwhelming her senses. I want the truth, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to penetrate her very soul. The whole truth. And I'm willing to pay for it. Rosie's eyes widened slightly. Pay? She echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Landry reached into his duster and pulled out a small, leather pouch. He tossed it onto the porch swing between them. It landed with a soft thud, the weight of its contents evident. Gold, he said simply. Enough to start a new life. Somewhere far away from here. Rosie stared at the pouch, her mind racing. It was a tempting offer, a chance to escape, to leave behind the ghosts and the secrets that haunted her. But it was also a trap, a way for Landry to confirm his suspicions, to force her to reveal the truth. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. And what if I refuse? His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. Then I'll find the truth myself, Mrs. Monroe. And I promise you, you won't like the consequences. The threat was clear, unmistakable. Rosie knew she had no choice. She was caught between a rock and a hard place, between the devil she knew and the devil she didn't. But she was a survivor. She had faced down death before, and she would face it again if she had to. "All right, Mr. Landry," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "You have a deal." She reached for the pouch, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange mix of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite define. She pulled the pouch towards her, the weight of it feeling heavy in her hand, heavy with the price of her secrets. He watched as she opened the pouch, her gaze focused on the gleam of gold. "But know this," Rosie added, lifting her gaze to meet Landry's, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across the porch, making her appear almost ethereal, a figure from a half-forgotten legend. "The truth, it's a dangerous thing, Mr. Landry. And sometimes it's better left buried." The air was still, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the dry grasses, a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken promises and impending revelations. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. Rosie tucked the pouch into the pocket of her apron, the weight of the gold a tangible reminder of the bargain she had struck. It felt like blood money, tainted by the secrets it represented, by the danger it invited. She knew that accepting it was a gamble, a dangerous dance with a man who was as unpredictable as the desert winds. But she had no other choice. Running was no longer an option. Landry watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes still holding that unsettling intensity. He hadn't moved, hadn't broken the silent tension that stretched between them. He was waiting, she knew, waiting for her to make the next move, to begin unraveling the tangled web of lies she had woven. "Where do you want to start, Mr. Landry?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her. She had to maintain control, to dictate the pace of this dangerous game, to prevent him from uncovering more than she was willing to reveal. He gestured towards the rocking chair. "Sit down, Mrs. Monroe. Let's talk about Thomas." The name, spoken with such casual familiarity, sent a jolt of pain through Rosie. It was a name she had tried to bury, a name that conjured up a maelstrom of guilt, regret, and a love that had turned sour, poisoned by betrayal and desperation. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered herself into the rocking chair, the rhythmic creak a familiar comfort in the face of the impending storm. Landry remained standing, his tall frame looming over her, his shadows stretching across the porch like a shroud. He pulled a slim, dark cheroot from his pocket, struck a match against the rough wood of the porch railing, and lit it. The pungent aroma of tobacco filled the air, mingling with the scent of dust and the lingering fragrance of Rosie's lavender soap. 5 years is a long time to mourn, Mrs. Monroe, he said, exhaling a plume of smoke that curled and dissipated in the evening air. Especially for a man who wasn't what he seemed. Rosie's grip tightened on the arms of the rocking chair. She forced herself to remain calm, to meet his gaze without flinching. "Thomas was my husband," she said, her voice tight. "I loved him." Landry raised a skeptical eyebrow, the scar bisecting it, giving him a perpetually cynical expression.
"Did you?"
he asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Or did you love the idea of him? The security he offered? The escape from whatever it was you were running from?" Rosie's breath caught in her throat. His words were too close to the truth, too perceptive for comfort. He was peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed facade, exposing the raw, vulnerable core beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a whisper. He took another drag of his cheroot, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think you do, Mrs. Monroe. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Thomas Monroe, he wasn't just a rancher, was he? He had other interests, other partners." Rosie's heart pounded in her chest. The ghosts stirred, their whispers growing louder, their accusations more insistent. She saw Thomas's face, his handsome features twisted in a cruel sneer, his eyes cold and calculating. She remembered the nights he spent away from home, the unexplained absences, the whispered rumors that had circulated through the town. "He was a good man," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Landry chuckled, a low, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Good men don't end up dead in a ditch with a bullet in their back, Mrs. Monroe. Especially not when that bullet came from their own wife's gun. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rosie's vision blurred. Her head swam. She felt as if she were drowning, suffocating under the weight of his words, the weight of the truth she had tried so hard to conceal. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. How did you know? He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that revealed nothing but his own satisfaction. I told you, Mrs. Monroe. I'm good at finding ghosts. And secrets. Yours they weren't as well hidden as you thought. He flicked the ash from his cheroot, the small, glowing ember falling to the dusty porch floor like a fallen star. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic beat of Rosie's heart and the distant, mournful cry of a lone wolf echoing across the vast, unforgiving landscape. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Past. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the aftermath of a sudden dust storm. Rosie felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare of the defenses she had so carefully erected. All the years of carefully crafted lies, of playing the grieving widow, had crumbled in an instant, leaving her standing naked before the truth, before the man who held her fate in his hands. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The weight of the evidence, the knowledge that he possessed, was too overwhelming. She simply stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange sense of relief. The burden of the secret, carried for so long, had finally been lifted, even if it meant facing the consequences. Landry watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes still holding that unsettling intensity. He seemed to be waiting for her to speak, to offer an explanation, a justification, anything to fill the gaping silence that had fallen between them. It wasn't like that, Rosie finally whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to convey the complex web of emotions, of betrayals, of desperation that had led to that fateful night. Then tell me what it was like, Mrs. Monroe, Landry said, his voice low and insistent. He took a step closer, his presence dominating the small space of the porch. Tell me everything. Rosie closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts, to find the words to describe the nightmare she had lived through. The ghosts crowded around her, their whispers a chorus of accusation and regret. Thomas's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and betrayal, swam before her. He was involved with outlaws, she began, her voice faltering. Cattle rustlers. Robbers. He kept it secret, of course. He presented himself as a respectable rancher, a pillar of the community. But it was all a lie. She opened her eyes, looking at Landry, searching for any sign of understanding, any hint of compassion in his hard, unforgiving gaze. I didn't know at first. I was naive. I believed in him. I loved him, or at least I thought I did. And then? Landry prompted, his voice devoid of emotion. And then I found out, Rosie continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by the bitter memory of betrayal. I found letters, hidden in his desk. Plans for raids, lists of names, details of their operations. I was horrified.
Disgusted.
Terrified. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the distant horizon, where the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the ugliness of the memories that flooded her mind. I confronted him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I told him I was going to the sheriff. I couldn't live with the lies anymore. I couldn't be a part of it. And he didn't like that, Landry said, his voice a statement, not a question. Rosie shook her head. He changed. He became violent.
He threatened me.
He said if I went to the sheriff, he would kill me. He would make sure no one ever found my body. She shivered, remembering the terror she had felt, the cold, hard fear that had gripped her heart. She had been trapped, a prisoner in her own home, at the mercy of a man who had become a stranger, a monster. That night, she continued, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears, He came home drunk.
Angry.
He was going to. She couldn't finish the sentence. The memory too painful, too raw. Landry's eyes narrowed. He was going to hurt you, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Rosie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I had a gun. A small pistol, hidden in my sewing basket. It was for protection. I never wanted to. She took a deep, shuddering breath. He lunged at me. I pulled the trigger. It was self-defense. I didn't mean to kill him. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with the weight of unspoken emotions, of shared pain, of a truth finally revealed. The ghosts were quiet, their whispers silenced by the raw honesty of Rosie's confession. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if in deference to the tragedy that had unfolded on that dusty porch, under the vast, indifferent sky. Chapter 6. The Devil's Due. Landry remained silent for a long while, studying Rosie's tear-streaked face, the raw emotion etched into every line. He had heard countless confessions, listened to the justifications of murderers, thieves, and liars. He had learned to distinguish between truth and falsehood, to read the subtle cues that betrayed a person's inner thoughts. And he believed her. He saw the pain in her eyes, the genuine remorse that twisted her features. He saw the fear that still lingered, the shadow of the trauma she had endured. He saw a woman who had been pushed to the brink, who had acted out of desperation, out of a primal instinct for survival. He finally broke the silence, his voice softer than it had been before, devoid of the harsh judgment she had expected. And the sheriff? Brody? He believed your story about the runaway horse? Rosie wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, a small, defiant gesture. He had no reason not to, she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. Thomas had enemies. Powerful enemies. It was easy to believe he'd been killed by someone else.
A rival gan.
A disgruntled partner. And the bullet? Landry pressed, his eyes still sharp, still probing. I buried it, Rosie confessed. Deep in the desert. No one ever found it. Landry nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond the town, a landscape that held countless secrets, countless unmarked graves. He could imagine her, alone under the cold light of the moon, digging a hole, burying the evidence, burying her past. So, you've been living with this for 5 years, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Living a lie, waiting for someone to come along and uncover the truth. I knew it was only a matter of time, Rosie replied, her voice resigned. I didn't expect it to be you. Landry straightened, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the porch. He took a step back, putting some distance between them. I wasn't hired to find Thomas Monroe's killer, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice returning to its usual, detached tone. I was hired to find you. Rosie's eyes widened.
Me? But why?
He reached into his duster and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased with age. He handed it to her. This was found among Thomas Monroe's belongings. After his death. Rosie unfolded the paper carefully, her hands trembling. It was a letter, written in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. As she read it, her blood ran cold. The letter spoke of a debt, a large sum of money that Thomas had owed to a man named Silas Blackwood, a notorious outlaw known for his ruthlessness and his insatiable greed. The letter threatened retribution if the debt wasn't paid, not just against Thomas, but against his wife, Rosalie. Silas Blackwood, Rosie whispered, her voice filled with dread. She had heard the name before, whispered in hushed tones in the saloon, spoken with fear and loathing. He was a devil, a man who reveled in violence and cruelty. Blackwood believes you have the money, Landry said, his voice confirming her worst fears. He believes Thomas hid it somewhere and that you know where it is. Rosie shook her head, her mind reeling. I don't know anything about any money. Thomas never told me anything. Blackwood doesn't care, Landry said, his voice grim. He wants what he's owed. And he's not a patient man. The weight of the situation crashed down on Rosie, crushing her with its implications. She was not only a killer, living under a false identity, but she was also a target, a pawn in a deadly game between two ruthless men. She was trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She looked up at Landry, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. What am I going to do? He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. You have a choice, Mrs. Monroe, he said. You can tell me the truth, tell me where the money is, and I'll help you. Or you can face Blackwood alone. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around them, creating a miniature vortex of chaos. The sun had finally set, leaving the porch shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the oil lamp that hung above the door. The decision before her loomed as large and dark as the night sky. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Skin. Rosie stared at Landry, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the glint of steel in his eyes. He was offering her a lifeline, a chance to escape the clutches of Silas Blackwood, but she knew it came with a price.
Trust.
And trust was a commodity she had learned to hoard, to guard as fiercely as her secrets. Could she trust him? A bounty hunter, a man who lived by the gun, a man who dealt in secrets and lies? He had uncovered her darkest secret, exposed her vulnerability, yet he hadn't condemned her. He had listened, he had understood, and now he was offering his help. But was it genuine? Or was it another trap, another layer of deception in this deadly game she was playing?
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you help me? You're a bounty hunter. You should be arresting me, turning me over to Blackwood. Landry's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something that might have been empathy crossing his features. I've seen a lot of things in my life, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice low and gravelly. A lot of darkness. A lot of injustice. And sometimes the lines between right and wrong get blurred. Sometimes the law isn't enough. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant horizon, as if he were seeing something beyond the darkness, something in his own past that mirrored Rosie's pain. I don't believe you're a killer, Mrs. Monroe, he continued, his voice returning to its usual, detached tone. I believe you were a victim. And I don't like seeing victims punished. Rosie searched his eyes, trying to discern the truth behind his words. She saw a weariness there, a hint of sadness, a reflection of the harsh realities of the life he had lived. She saw scars, not just the physical one that bisected his eyebrow, but deeper scars, hidden beneath the surface, scars that spoke of battles fought and lost, of wounds that hadn't fully healed. She realized then that he wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a man with his own demons, his own code of honor, his own sense of justice. He was a flawed, complex individual, just like her. And maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. There is no money, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I swear to you, Mr. Landry, Thomas never told me anything about any money. He kept his business dealings separate from our life. Landry studied her for a long moment, his eyes probing, searching for any flicker of deceit. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. I believe you, he said. Relief washed over Rosie, a wave of gratitude that almost brought her to her knees. She had been holding her breath, bracing herself for his disbelief, his condemnation. His acceptance, his willingness to believe her, was a gift she hadn't expected. But Blackwood won't, he continued, his voice grim. He'll come for you, Mrs. Monroe. And he won't be as understanding as I am. Rosie knew he was right. She had seen the ruthlessness in Blackwood's letter, the cold, calculating cruelty that lurked beneath the surface. She was a loose end, a potential witness, a threat to his operation. He wouldn't let her live, not unless he got what he wanted. What do we do? She asked, her voice betraying her fear. Landry's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. We fight, he said, his voice a low growl. We prepare. We make sure that when Blackwood comes, he'll be the one who ends up buried in the desert. His words were a promise, a vow, a declaration of war. And in that moment, Rosie knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, a protector, a man who was willing to stand beside her, to fight for her, to help her face the darkness that was coming. He stepped closer, his presence filling her space, his scent leather, dust, and that unsettling wildness a strange comfort in the face of the impending storm. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that intertwined, merging their silhouettes into one, a symbol of their newfound alliance, their shared destiny in the heart of a dangerous, unforgiving land. The wind whispered a mournful tune, the only witness to their new, tentative bond. Chapter 8. A Dance with Danger. The next few days were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Landry, with his experience and his knowledge of the outlaw world, took charge, transforming Rosie's quiet, isolated homestead into a fortress. He assessed the vulnerabilities, identified the potential points of attack, and devised a strategy to defend against Blackwood's inevitable assault. Rosie, despite her initial apprehension, found herself drawn into his world, drawn to his strength, his competence, his unwavering determination. She watched him work, his movements precise and economical, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, assessing the threats, anticipating the danger. She saw the warrior in him, the man who had lived by the gun, the man who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. But she also saw glimpses of the man beneath the hardened exterior, the man who carried his own scars, his own burdens. She saw it in the way he handled her gun, with a respect and a familiarity that spoke of years of experience, but also with a hint of sadness, a recognition of the weapon's destructive power. She saw it in the quiet moments when he would sit on the porch, staring out at the vast, empty landscape, his expression lost in thought, his eyes reflecting a weariness that mirrored her own. They worked together, side by side, strengthening the fences, reinforcing the doors and windows, setting traps in the surrounding area. They practiced shooting, Landry teaching Rosie how to handle a rifle, how to aim, how to fire with accuracy and precision. She was a surprisingly quick learner, her determination fueled by a newfound sense of purpose, a desire to protect herself, to fight for her survival. They shared meals, simple fare of beans, bacon, and coffee, eaten in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire, the distant howl of a coyote. They talked, sharing stories of their pasts, fragments of their lives, pieces of the puzzle that made them who they were. Rosie learned about Landry's childhood on a struggling ranch, his early encounters with violence and injustice, his decision to become a bounty hunter, a man who walked the line between law and outlaw, seeking his own brand of justice. Landry, in turn, learned more about Rosie's life before Thomas, her dreams of a peaceful existence, her disillusionment with love, her desperate attempt to escape a past that had haunted her. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering spirit, and he admired her for it. The tension between them, the unspoken attraction that had simmered beneath the surface, began to grow, fueled by their shared danger, their mutual respect, their growing understanding of each other. It was a dangerous dance, a delicate balance between fear and desire, between restraint and surrender. They were drawn to each other, pulled by an invisible force, yet they held back, aware of the risks, the potential consequences. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Landry turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You know," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "you don't have to stay here. You could leave. Go somewhere safe. Start over." Rosie shook her head. "This is my home," she said, her voice firm. "I've run enough. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid." "It's not fear, Rosie," Landry said, his hand reaching out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a jolt of electricity that startled her. "It's survival. And what's the difference?" she asked, her eyes meeting his, the question hanging in the air between them. He didn't answer. He simply held her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the beating of their hearts, the whisper of the wind, the growing sense of inevitability that hung over them, as dark and as certain as the approaching night. The moment lingered, charged and unspoken. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Coil. The waiting was the hardest part. The anticipation, the constant state of alert, the knowledge that Blackwood and his men could appear at any moment, from any direction, kept Rosie on edge, her nerves frayed, her senses heightened. She found herself jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the dry grass. Sleep was a luxury she could barely afford, her nights filled with restless dreams, with images of violence and death, with the menacing figure of Silas Blackwood looming over her. Landry, too, was affected by the waiting. He became even more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. He spoke less, his silence a reflection of the tension that gripped them, the unspoken fear that hung in the air like a shroud. He patrolled the perimeter of the homestead constantly, checking the traps, reinforcing the defenses, his presence a reassuring, if somewhat unsettling, constant in Rosie's life. One afternoon, while Rosie was cleaning her rifle, Landry returned from one of his patrols, his expression grim. He held something in his hand, a small, coiled object that glinted in the sunlight. "What is it?" Rosie asked, her heart quickening with a sense of dread. "Rattlesnake," Landry said, his voice flat. "Left near the well. A warning." Rosie's blood ran cold. She knew what it meant. Blackwood was playing with them, taunting them, letting them know he was close, that he was watching. It was a psychological tactic designed to unnerve them, to make them doubt, to make them afraid. "He's close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Landry nodded. "He's testing us, seeing how we react. He wants us to make a mistake." "What do we do?" Rosie asked, her voice barely audible. Landry's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "We don't give him what he wants," he said, his voice a low growl. "We stay calm. We stay alert. We stay alive." He tossed the dead rattlesnake into the dust, crushing it under his heel, a symbolic gesture of defiance. He met Rosie's gaze, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're ready for him," he said. "We'll face him together." His words, his confidence, gave Rosie a renewed sense of courage. She was still afraid, but she wasn't paralyzed by fear. She had Landry beside her, and she knew that together, they could withstand whatever Blackwood threw at them. That night, the tension reached a breaking point. The moon was full, casting an eerie, silver glow over the landscape, turning familiar objects into menacing shadows. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows, shaking the walls of the house. Rosie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing, her body tense and alert. She heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from outside. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her pistol, her hand trembling. She crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. She saw a figure, silhouetted against the moonlit landscape, moving stealthily towards the house. It was one of Blackwood's men. She was sure of it. He was carrying something in his hand, a dark, bulky object that glinted ominously in the moonlight. Rosie's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had to act fast. She raised her pistol, aiming at the figure. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her arm, stopping her. Landry. He had been standing behind her, silent and watchful. "Not yet," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
"Wait."
Rosie hesitated, her finger still on the trigger, her body trembling with adrenaline. She wanted to shoot, to eliminate the threat, to protect herself. But she trusted Landry. She trusted his judgment, his experience. The figure continued to approach the house, unaware of their presence, unaware that he was walking into a trap. He reached the porch, his hand reaching for the doorknob. That's when Landry moved. With lightning speed, he threw open the door, his gun drawn and aimed. The figure whirled around, startled, his eyes widening in surprise. The night exploded in a cacophony of gunfire, the roar of the shots echoing across the silent landscape, the muzzle flashes illuminating the scene in brief, violent bursts of light. The figure crumpled to the ground, his body riddled with bullets. It all happened with a quick, vicious ferocity. The echoes lingered, a silent testament to the thin line between survival and oblivion. Chapter 10. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Rosie and Landry and the mournful howl of the wind. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, acrid and sharp, a reminder of the violence that had just transpired. Landry stood over the fallen man, his gun still smoking, his expression grim. He nudged the body with his boot, confirming that he was dead. He then turned to Rosie, his eyes searching hers. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Rosie nodded, her body still trembling from the adrenaline surge. She was shaken, but she wasn't injured. She had been close, too close, to death, but Landry had saved her. Again. He was going to, she stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "I know," Landry said, his voice softening slightly. "It's all right.
He's gone."
He holstered his gun, then reached out and took Rosie's hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. He led her away from the body, away from the porch, back into the house. They sat down at the kitchen table, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Rosie poured them both a cup of coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. The warmth of the cup, the familiar aroma of the coffee, helped to calm her nerves. "That was close," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Landry nodded. "Too close," he agreed. "Blackwood's getting desperate. He's sending his men in one by one, trying to wear us down."
"How many more?"
Rosie asked, her voice filled with dread. "I don't know," Landry admitted. "But we can't stay here. It's too dangerous. He knows where we are. He'll keep coming." Rosie's heart sank. She had hoped that they could hold out, that they could defend the homestead. But Landry was right. It was a losing battle. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They had to leave. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Landry was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the swirling coffee in his cup. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering their next move. "There's a place," he finally said, his voice low and hesitant. "An old mining town, abandoned years ago. It's called Shadow Gulch. It's remote, hidden in the mountains. It's not much, but it's defensible." "Shadow Gulch," Rosie repeated, the name sounding ominous, foreboding. "Is it safe?" Landry shrugged. "Safer than here," he said. "But nowhere is truly safe, Rosie. Not anymore." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked like regret. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "Pack only what you need. We'll travel light and fast." Rosie nodded, her mind racing. She had to prepare, to gather her belongings, to leave behind the only home she had known for the past 5 years. It was a daunting task, but she had no choice. She had to survive. As she was gathering her things, she stumbled upon a small, wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. It was a box she hadn't opened in years, a box that contained mementos of her life with Thomas. Curiosity, and a pang of something she couldn't quite name, perhaps a lingering sense of grief, or maybe just a need to confront the past, compelled her to open it. Inside, she found old photographs, letters, trinkets, and a folded piece of paper tucked away in a hidden compartment. She unfolded the paper carefully, her hands trembling. It was a map, a crudely drawn map of the surrounding area, with a specific location marked with an X. And beneath the X, a single word: redemption. Rosie's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the location. It was a small, secluded canyon, a few miles outside of town, a place where she and Thomas had gone picnicking once, years ago. A place she had forgotten about until now. Could it be? Could this be the place where Thomas had hidden the money? The money that Blackwood was so desperately seeking? A wave of nausea washed over her. She had told Landry the truth. She hadn't known about the money. But Thomas had known. He had planned this. He had anticipated that someone might come looking for it. And he had left her to deal with the consequences. The betrayal stung, sharp and bitter, like a poison arrow piercing her heart. She had loved him, trusted him, and he had used her, manipulated her, left her to face a deadly enemy alone. She stared at the map, her mind reeling. She had a choice to make. She could keep the map a secret, continue to deny any knowledge of the money, and hope that Landry would protect her. Or she could tell him the truth, reveal the location, and risk everything. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The ghosts stirred, their whispers a chorus of accusation and doubt. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that echoed the turmoil in her soul. Chapter 11. The Gunslinger's Requiem. Rosie clutched the map, her knuckles white, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Betrayal, anger, fear, and a strange, unsettling sense of inevitability warred within her. She had trusted Thomas, loved him, and he had repaid her with deception, with a legacy of danger that now threatened to consume her. She looked up, hearing Landry's footsteps approaching. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene: the open box, the scattered mementos, the map clutched tightly in her hand. He didn't speak, but his expression tightened, his gaze hardening. He knew. He sensed that something had changed, that another layer of the truth had been revealed. "What is it, Rosie?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Rosie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still keep the secret, she could still deny any knowledge of the money. But something had shifted within her. The betrayal had broken something, released her from the shackles of the past. She was tired of lying, tired of running, tired of being afraid. She took a deep breath and held out the map. "I found this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was hidden in Thomas's things. Landry took the map, his eyes scanning the crude drawing, the marked location, the single word: redemption. He recognized the area, she could see it in his eyes. He knew what it meant. "He hid the money," Rosie said, her voice barely a whisper. He knew someone would come looking for it." Landry's jaw tightened. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Was he disappointed in her? Did he think she had been lying to him all along? "I didn't know," Rosie said, her voice pleading. "I swear to you, Landry, I didn't know anything about it." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the frantic beat of her heart. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I didn't know," Rosie repeated, her voice faltering. "I just found it. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Landry asked, his voice sharp. "Afraid of me? Afraid of Blackwood? Or afraid of the truth?" His words stung, but she couldn't deny them. She had been afraid of all of those things. But she was also afraid of something else, something she hadn't dared to admit to herself. She was afraid of losing him, of losing the fragile trust, the tentative connection that had grown between them. She began, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't explain. She couldn't articulate the complex web of emotions that churned within her. Landry turned away, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He stared out the window, at the gathering dawn, the sky streaked with pale shades of pink and orange. The beauty of the morning was a stark contrast to the darkness that had descended upon them. "We're leaving," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion.
"Now."
He didn't wait for her. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by the remnants of her past, by the shattered pieces of her life. Rosie quickly gathered her belongings, her heart heavy with a sense of dread. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. She had revealed the truth, but in doing so, she had lost something precious, something irreplaceable. She had lost Landry's trust. As they rode away from the homestead, the rising sun casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty landscape, Rosie couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. She had been so focused on escaping Blackwood, on surviving, that she had forgotten about the one thing that truly mattered. The connection, the bond, the fragile spark of hope that had flickered between her and Landry. The journey to Shadow Gulch was silent and tense. Landry rode ahead, his back stiff, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her. He was a stranger again, a distant, unapproachable figure. As they approached a narrow pass, a volley of gunfire erupted, the bullets whizzing past them, kicking up dust and splinters of rock. Ambush. Blackwood's men. Landry reacted instantly, drawing his gun, returning fire. He shouted at Rosie to take cover, to get down. But Rosie, fueled by a desperate need to prove herself, to regain his trust, did the opposite. She drew her own rifle, the one Landry had taught her to use, and joined the fight. She fired with a surprising accuracy, her aim steady, her determination unwavering. She saw one of the outlaws fall, her bullet finding its mark. The gunfight was short and brutal. Landry, with his superior skills and experience, quickly dispatched the remaining attackers. But not before one of them got off a lucky shot. "Landry!" He cried out, clutching his shoulder, his body slumping in the saddle. He was hit. Rosie's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to his side, her fear overwhelming her. She had to help him. She had to save him. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the sound of Landry's labored breathing and Rosie's frantic heartbeat. Chapter 12. Roads Less Traveled. Rosie leaped from her horse, her hands trembling as she reached for Landry. He was slumped in the saddle, his face pale, his shirt stained with blood. The bullet had struck him in the shoulder, high up, but it was bleeding profusely. "Landry!" she cried, her voice filled with panic. "Hold on. I'll get you down." He groaned, his eyes flickering open. He looked at her, his gaze hazy, unfocused. "Rosie," he whispered, his voice weak. "Get out of here now." She protested. "I'm not leaving you." She struggled to get him out of the saddle, his weight almost too much for her to bear. She managed to lower him to the ground, gently laying him on his back. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, pressing it against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "I need to get you to Shadow Gulch," she said, her voice urgent. "It's not far. We can make it." Landry shook his head weakly. "No, too dangerous," he whispered. "Blackwood will be waiting." He was right. Shadow Gulch was the obvious destination. Blackwood would expect them to go there. It was a trap. Rosie's mind raced. She had to think fast. She had to find somewhere safe, somewhere where she could tend to Landry's wound, somewhere where they could hide from Blackwood. She remembered a small, abandoned cabin, nestled in a hidden valley, a place she had stumbled upon years ago, while exploring the countryside. It was off the beaten path, secluded, forgotten. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. "There's another place," she said, her voice determined. "A cabin. It's hidden. No one knows about it." Landry looked at her, his eyes questioning, his strength fading. He didn't have the energy to argue. He simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. Rosie carefully helped him back onto his horse, supporting his weight, holding him steady. She mounted her own horse, then took the reins of Landry's mare, leading him slowly, carefully, towards the hidden valley. The journey was agonizingly slow, each step a torturous effort for Landry. He was losing blood, growing weaker by the minute. Rosie kept talking to him, encouraging him, trying to keep him conscious, her voice a desperate litany of hope and fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the cabin. It was small, dilapidated, overgrown with weeds, but it was shelter. It was safe. Rosie helped Landry dismount, carefully lowering him to the ground inside the cabin. She built a fire, using the few remaining pieces of firewood she found stacked near the hearth. She boiled water, using a rusty pot she found hanging on a hook. She cleaned Landry's wound, her hands surprisingly steady, her touch gentle. She worked tirelessly, tending to his injuries, nursing him, her fear overshadowed by a fierce determination to keep him alive. She had lost so much. She couldn't lose him too. As the night wore on, Landry's fever spiked. He tossed and turned, muttering deliriously, his words a jumbled mix of names and places, fragments of his past, his regrets, his fears. Rosie stayed by his side, holding his hand, wiping his brow, whispering soothing words, her voice a constant presence in the darkness. She realized, as she watched him struggle, that she had fallen in love with him. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a gradual awakening, a slow burn that had ignited in the midst of danger, fueled by their shared experiences, their mutual respect, their growing understanding of each other. It was a love born of adversity, a love forged in the crucible of survival. It was a love that was unexpected, unconventional, and perhaps doomed. But it was real. It was powerful. And it was the only thing that mattered to her now. As dawn approached, Landry's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, his gaze clear, focused. He looked at Rosie, his expression filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that mirrored her own feelings. The faint light of the new day filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, illuminating their faces, their shared vulnerability, their unspoken love, hanging heavy in the silence. Chapter 13. Fires of the Heart. The days that followed were a strange interlude, a period of quiet intimacy and healing, tucked away in the secluded cabin, far from the dangers of the outside world. Rosie tended to Landry's wound, changing the bandages, brewing herbal remedies, nursing him back to health with a tenderness and a dedication that surprised even herself. Landry, in turn, slowly regained his strength, his body healing, his spirit mending. He watched Rosie, his eyes filled with a growing admiration, a deepening affection. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering loyalty, and he realized that he had found something rare and precious, something he had never expected to find in his life. They talked, sharing stories, secrets, dreams, fears. They learned about each other's pasts, the wounds that had shaped them, the hopes that still flickered within them. They discovered a connection, a bond that transcended their circumstances, their differences, their shared danger. The unspoken attraction that had simmered between them from the beginning now blossomed into something deeper, something more profound. It was a love born of shared adversity, of mutual respect, of a growing understanding that they were two souls, scarred by life, but not broken, finding solace and strength in each other's presence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Landry reached out and took Rosie's hand. His touch was gentle, hesitant, but it sent a shiver of warmth through her. "Rosie," he said, his voice low and gravelly, I need to tell you something." Rosie looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in his touch. "I've never felt this way about anyone before," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I've lived a hard life, a lonely life. I never believed I deserved." He paused, his gaze searching hers, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I love you, Rosie," he said, the words spoken softly, but with a conviction that resonated deep within her soul. Tears welled up in Rosie's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love finally acknowledged, finally expressed. She squeezed his hand, her own voice choked with emotion. "I love you too, Landry," she whispered. "I love you too." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. They embraced, their bodies melting together, their hearts beating as one. The kiss that followed was slow, tender, filled with a passion that had been simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be ignited. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that defied the dangers that still lurked outside the cabin walls. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of healing, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places, in the most trying of circumstances. They spent the night together, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies intertwined, their souls connected. They made love, slowly, tenderly, their passion fueled by a deep, abiding affection, by a need to connect, to heal, to find solace in each other's presence. As the dawn broke, casting a soft, golden light through the cracks in the cabin walls. Rosie lay in Landry's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt a sense of peace, a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. She had found love. She had found hope. She had found a reason to fight, a reason to live. But she knew their idyll couldn't last. Blackwood was still out there, waiting, hunting. They had to face him. They had to confront the danger that threatened to destroy their newfound happiness. She looked up at Landry, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He kissed her forehead, his touch gentle, reassuring. "We fight," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We fight together. And we win." The resolve in his voice was a promise, a vow, a testament to their love, their strength, their shared destiny. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Canyon. Landry, though still recovering, insisted on formulating a plan. He knew Blackwood's tactics, his ruthlessness, his relentless pursuit of the money he believed Rosie possessed. Staying hidden in the cabin was no longer an option. They had to take the fight to Blackwood, to confront him on their own terms, before he found them again. "We'll use the map," Landry said, his voice firm, his eyes focused on the crude drawing that had changed their lives. "We'll go to Redemption Canyon. We'll set a trap." Rosie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She trusted Landry. She trusted his judgment, his experience. But she also knew the risks, the dangers that awaited them. "It's what Thomas would have wanted," she said, her voice barely a whisper, a hint of bitterness lacing her words. "He set this whole thing in motion. He left me to deal with the consequences." Landry looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew the pain, the betrayal she felt. He had seen it in her eyes, heard it in her voice. "It's not about Thomas anymore, Rosie," he said, his voice gentle. "It's about us. It's about our future." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a surge of warmth through her. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll do this together," he said. "We'll face him together. And we'll win." They left the cabin at dawn, riding slowly, carefully, towards Redemption Canyon. The landscape was rugged and beautiful, the rising sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the rocky terrain. The air was crisp and cool, the silence broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves and the distant cry of a hawk. As they approached the canyon, Landry signaled Rosie to stop. He dismounted, his hand never far from his gun. He scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of Blackwood, any indication of an ambush. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll go ahead. I'll make sure it's clear." Rosie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched him disappear into the canyon, his figure swallowed by the shadows, her fear growing with each passing moment. She waited, her senses on high alert, her hand gripping her rifle. The silence was unnerving, the anticipation almost unbearable. She jumped at every sound, every rustle of the wind, every creak of a branch. Suddenly, she heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Her heart leaped into her throat. Landry! He was in trouble. She didn't hesitate. She spurred her horse forward, riding into the canyon, her rifle at the ready. She had to help him. She had to save him. She rounded a bend in the canyon and saw him. He was engaged in a fierce gunfight with several men, outnumbered, outgunned. Blackwood's men. Rosie raised her rifle, taking aim. She fired, her shots finding their mark, one of the outlaws falling to the ground. She fired again, and again, her accuracy surprising even herself. The gunfight was chaotic, the air filled with the roar of gunfire, the shouts of men, the smell of gunpowder. Rosie fought with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed, her fear replaced by a fierce determination to protect Landry, to fight for their survival. She saw Blackwood then, his face contorted in rage, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating cruelty. He was aiming his gun at Landry, his finger tightening on the trigger. Rosie screamed, a desperate, primal cry. She fired her rifle, her bullet striking Blackwood in the arm, throwing off his aim. Landry seized the opportunity, firing his own gun, his bullet finding its mark. Blackwood crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, his reign of terror finally over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Rosie and Landry and the echoes of the gunfire reverberating through the canyon walls. It was over. They had won. They had survived. The dust settled, revealing the aftermath of the battle, a testament to the brutal cost of their victory. Chapter 15. The Unforgiven. Rosie rushed to Landry's side, her heart pounding with relief and fear. He was leaning against a rock, his face pale, his breathing labored. He had been shot again, this time in the leg. "Landry," she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "Are you all right?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a flicker of pride. He managed a weak smile. "I'll live," he said, his voice raspy.
Thanks to you.
Rosie knelt beside him, examining his wound. It was bleeding, but not as badly as the previous one. She ripped a strip of cloth from her skirt, wrapping it tightly around his leg, trying to staunch the flow of blood. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to get you to a doctor." Landry shook his head. "No, not yet," he said, his voice weak. "The money, it's here somewhere." Rosie's heart sank. Even now, even after everything they had been through, the money was still a factor, still a driving force in their lives. "Forget the money, Landry," she pleaded. "It's not worth it. Your life is more important." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, wrestling with a decision. "It's not just about the money, Rosie," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's about justice. It's about making things right." He pointed towards a small crevice in the canyon wall, hidden behind a cluster of rocks. "It's in there," he said. "Thomas, he hid it there." Rosie hesitated, her mind reeling. She didn't want to go near the money. She didn't want to touch it. It felt tainted, cursed, a symbol of the greed and violence that had brought them to this point. But she knew Landry wouldn't rest until he had retrieved it, until he had fulfilled his obligation. She owed him that much. She owed him everything. She carefully made her way to the crevice, her heart pounding with apprehension. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something cold and hard. She pulled it out. It was a metal box, heavy and locked. The money. Thomas's ill-gotten gains. The source of all their troubles. She carried the box back to Landry, her hands trembling. He looked at it, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Open it," he said, his voice weak. Rosie hesitated, then found a rock and smashed the lock. The lid creaked open, revealing stacks of cash, neatly bundled, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Landry stared at the money, his expression unreadable. He then looked up at Rosie, his eyes meeting hers. This isn't mine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It belongs to the people Thomas stole it from. The ranchers, the homesteaders, the families he ruined." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the bodies of Blackwood and his men, lying lifeless on the canyon floor. "I'm going to return it," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm going to make things right. I'm going to atone." Rosie's heart swelled with pride and admiration. She had known, deep down, that Landry was a good man, a man of honor, a man who believed in justice. But this was beyond anything she had expected. "I'll help you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We'll do it together." They spent the next few days tracking down the people who had been victimized by Thomas and Blackwood, returning the stolen money, offering apologies, trying to make amends. It was a long and arduous process, but it was also a healing process, a way for them to cleanse themselves of the past, to find redemption. As they rode away from Redemption Canyon, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape, Rosie felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She had faced her demons, she had confronted her past, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient, more hopeful. She had also found love, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that had sustained her, protected her, given her a reason to fight, a reason to live. She looked at Landry, riding beside her, his face etched with determination, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. She knew that their journey wasn't over, that there would be other challenges, other obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that together, they could face anything. They were survivors. They were the unforgiven. And they were finally, truly free. Chapter 16. Blood on the Horizon. The return of the stolen money had brought a measure of peace, a sense of justice served, to the ravaged communities around Redemption Gulch. Rosie and Landry worked tirelessly, traveling from ranch to ranch, homestead to homestead, their actions speaking louder than any words of apology could. They were met with a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and lingering resentment, but with each returned dollar, with each heartfelt explanation, the wounds of the past began to heal, the seeds of trust slowly taking root. But their actions had also attracted attention. News of their deeds, of the mysterious bounty hunter and the widow who were righting the wrongs of the past, spread like wildfire across the territory. And it reached the ears of someone who saw their actions not as justice, but as a threat. Sheriff Brody. The man who had seemingly accepted Rosie's story about Thomas's death, the man who had ruled it an accident, the man who had closed the case. He was not the honest, if somewhat weary, lawman he appeared to be. He was corrupt, deeply in debt to Blackwood, a silent partner in his criminal enterprise. And he was now facing ruin. Brody knew that Rosie and Landry were a danger to him, that they could expose his corruption, his complicity in Blackwood's crimes. He couldn't allow that to happen. He had to silence them, permanently. He gathered his deputies, a motley crew of loyal, if somewhat dim-witted, men, and set out to track them down. He painted them as outlaws, as criminals who had murdered Blackwood and his men, who were now terrorizing the countryside. He offered a reward for their capture, dead or alive. Rosie and Landry, unaware of Brody's treachery, were riding towards a small, struggling town called Haven, hoping to find a doctor to tend to Landry's still healing leg. They were tired, weary, but also filled with a sense of purpose, a belief that they were making a difference. As they approached Haven, they were met not with welcome, but with hostility. The townsfolk, armed with rifles and shotguns, blocked their path, their faces grim, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. "You're not welcome here," one of the men, a grizzled, older rancher, spat out. "We know who you are. We know what you've done." Rosie and Landry exchanged a confused look. They had done nothing to harm these people. They had only tried to help. "We don't understand," Rosie said, her voice calm, trying to defuse the situation. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to see a doctor." "Liar," another man shouted. "Sheriff Brody warned us about you. He said you were killers, thieves." Landry's eyes narrowed. "Brody?" he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What did he tell you?" The men explained, their words painting a distorted, fabricated picture of Rosie and Landry as ruthless criminals, as enemies of the people. Landry listened, his anger growing with each passing moment. He realized then that Brody was the true villain, the puppet master who had been pulling the strings all along. "He's lying," Landry said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Brody is corrupt. He was in league with Blackwood. He's trying to cover his tracks." The townsfolk hesitated, their suspicion wavering. They looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had trusted Brody, but Landry's words rang with a truth they couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Landry's head, embedding itself in a nearby wooden post. The townsfolk scattered, taking cover, their fear reignited. Brody and his deputies rode into view, their guns drawn, their faces set in grim determination. "There they are," Brody shouted. "The killers. Don't let them escape." Rosie and Landry were caught in a crossfire, trapped between the suspicious townsfolk and the corrupt lawmen. They had to fight, they had to defend themselves, but they also had to prove their innocence, to expose Brody's treachery. The horizon seemed to bleed with the colors of the setting sun, mirroring the violence that was about to erupt, the blood that was about to be spilled. Chapter 17. Masks of Deception. The situation was dire. Surrounded, outnumbered, and branded as criminals, Rosie and Landry found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. The townsfolk, caught in the middle, were confused and frightened, unsure who to believe, who to trust. "Hold your fire," Landry shouted, his voice booming across the makeshift battlefield. "Brody is lying. He's the criminal." He was Blackwood's partner. Brody laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the town square. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to deceive you. He's a killer, just like his wife." Rosie's blood ran cold. Brody's words were a calculated attack, designed to turn the townsfolk against them, to isolate them, to make them easier targets. "It's not true," Rosie cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Thomas was involved with Blackwood, not me." Brody knew. He covered it up. Some of the townsfolk hesitated, their eyes flickering between Rosie and Brody, their uncertainty growing. They had seen Rosie and Landry return the stolen money. They had witnessed their acts of kindness, their attempts to make amends. Could they be lying? Could Brody be the true villain? "He's lying to protect himself," Landry shouted, pointing his gun at Brody. "He's afraid of being exposed. He's afraid of facing justice." Brody sneered. "Justice? You don't know the meaning of the word. You're outlaws, both of you, and you'll pay for your crimes." He raised his gun, aiming at Landry. Rosie reacted instantly, drawing her own pistol, firing at Brody. Her shot went wide, missing its target, but it distracted him, giving Landry a chance to dive for cover. The gunfight erupted, the town square exploding in a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Rosie and Landry fought back to back, protecting each other, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other unwavering. But they were outnumbered. Brody's deputies, though hesitant at first, were now firing at them, their loyalty to their sheriff, their fear of the consequences, overriding their doubts. Rosie saw one of the deputies aiming at Landry, his finger tightening on the trigger.
She didn't hesitate.
She pushed Landry out of the way, taking the bullet herself. She cried out, a sharp, searing pain exploding in her shoulder. She stumbled, falling to the ground, her pistol slipping from her grasp. "Rosie!" Landry shouted, his voice filled with anguish. He rushed to her side, his eyes filled with fear and fury. He knelt beside her, examining her wound. It was bad, bleeding profusely. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against her shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. "Hold on, Rosie," he said, his voice trembling. "Hold on. I won't let you die." He looked up, his eyes blazing with rage. He saw Brody, standing across the square, a smug, triumphant expression on his face. "You'll pay for this, Brody," Landry roared. "You'll pay for everything." He raised his gun, aiming at Brody, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a voice rang out, stopping him. "Hold your fire, Sheriff." It was Old Man Hemlock, the livery stable owner from Redemption Gulch. He was standing at the edge of the square, his rifle aimed at Brody, his expression grim, determined. And behind him stood Martha Jenkins, the baker, and several other residents of Redemption Gulch, all armed, all ready to fight. They had come to help Rosie and Landry. They had finally seen the truth. The masks of deception were falling, revealing the true faces of the heroes and the villains. Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The arrival of the Redemption Gulch residents changed the dynamic of the conflict instantly. Brody's deputies, seeing themselves outnumbered and facing the wrath of the very people they were supposed to protect, hesitated, their resolve crumbling. They lowered their weapons, their faces etched with confusion and fear. "What's the meaning of this, Hemlock?" Brody demanded, his voice laced with a mixture of anger and desperation. He tried to maintain his facade of authority, but his voice wavered, his confidence shaken. "We know the truth, Brody," Hemlock said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "We know about your dealings with Blackwood. We know you framed Rosie and Landry. You're lying, Brody shouted, his face turning red with rage. They're criminals. They murdered Blackwood. Blackwood was a devil, Martha Jenkins interjected, her voice surprisingly strong, her eyes filled with a righteous fury.
He deserved to die.
And you helped him. You profited from his crimes. The other residents of Redemption Gulch murmured their agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. They had been deceived, manipulated, used by Brody, and they were no longer willing to stand for it. Brody's eyes darted around, his gaze frantic, desperate. He was trapped, cornered, his lies exposed. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You can't prove anything, he shouted, his voice cracking. It's their word against mine. We have proof, Brody, Landry said, his voice cold, his eyes filled with a chilling calm. He was still holding Rosie, supporting her weight, his hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder. We have witnesses. We have evidence. He gestured towards the townsfolk of Haven, who had been silent witnesses to Brody's treachery. They heard you, Landry said. They saw you try to kill us. They know the truth. The townsfolk of Haven, emboldened by the arrival of the Redemption Gulch residents, stepped forward, their voices joining the chorus of condemnation. They had been fooled by Brody, but they were no longer afraid. They were ready to speak out, to demand justice. Brody's face crumbled. He knew he was defeated. His lies had caught up with him. His reign of terror was over. He slowly lowered his gun, his hand trembling. He looked at Landry, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. You won't get away with this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's not about getting away with anything, Brody, Landry said, his voice devoid of emotion. It's about justice. It's about accountability. It's about making things right. He nodded towards Hemlock and the other residents of Redemption Gulch.
Take him, he said.
Take him to the nearest judge. Let him face the consequences of his actions. Hemlock and the others stepped forward, disarming Brody and his deputies, binding their hands, leading them away. The townsfolk of Haven watched in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and shame. They had been deceived, but they had also played a part in the injustice. Landry turned his attention back to Rosie, his heart aching with concern. She was pale, weak, but she was still conscious. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thank you for believing in me. I always believed in you, Rosie, Landry said, his voice choked with emotion. Always. He gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her towards the town's doctor, his steps determined, his heart filled with a fierce love, a profound sense of relief. The reckoning had come, justice had been served, but the battle for their future was far from over. They still had a long road ahead, a road filled with challenges, but also with hope, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 19. Where the Sun Sets Red. The doctor in Haven, a kind, elderly woman named Sarah, worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning and stitching Rosie's wound, assuring Landry that it wasn't life-threatening, but that she needed rest and care. Rosie, exhausted and weak from blood loss, drifted in and out of consciousness, her hand clinging tightly to Landry's, her only anchor in a sea of pain and uncertainty. Landry stayed by her side, watching over her, his heart heavy with worry, but also filled with a profound sense of gratitude. They had survived. They had faced their demons, they had overcome the odds, and they had emerged victorious. But the victory had come at a cost. The news of Brody's arrest and the revelation of his corruption spread quickly through the territory, bringing a sense of relief and renewed hope to the communities that had suffered under his reign. The stolen money, recovered from Redemption Canyon, was fully returned, the debts repaid, the injustices rectified. Rosie and Landry became symbols of hope, of resilience, of the power of justice. They were hailed as heroes, their names whispered with respect and admiration. But they sought no accolades, no recognition. They simply wanted to heal, to rebuild their lives, to find peace. As Rosie slowly regained her strength, they decided to leave Haven, to return to Redemption Gulch, to the homestead that had been both a prison and a sanctuary, a place of shadows and secrets, but also a place where they had found each other, where they had discovered a love that had defied the odds. The journey back was slow and quiet, the landscape unfolding before them, vast and beautiful, scarred by the past, but also filled with the promise of a new beginning. They rode side by side, their silence comfortable, their bond stronger than ever. They reached Redemption Gulch as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the dusty town, painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple. The town was no longer the ghost town it had once been. It was slowly coming back to life, the residents rebuilding their homes, their businesses, their lives. They were greeted with cheers, with smiles, with heartfelt expressions of gratitude. Old Man Hemlock and Martha Jenkins rushed to meet them, their faces etched with relief and joy. They had feared the worst. They had doubted they would ever see them again. "We're so glad you're back," Hemlock said, his voice choked with emotion. "We're so proud of you." "You brought justice to this land," Martha added, her eyes filled with tears. "You gave us hope." Rosie and Landry were overwhelmed by the welcome, by the outpouring of love and support. They had never expected this. They had never sought it. They had simply done what they believed was right. They returned to the homestead, the small, ramshackle house that had witnessed so much pain, so much loss, but also so much love, so much resilience. It was no longer a place of shadows, but a place of light, a place of hope. As they stood on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in a breathtaking display of color, Landry turned to Rosie, his eyes filled with a love that was deep, profound, unwavering. "We did it, Rosie," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. "We made it." Rosie smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "We did," she agreed, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it together." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. They embraced, their bodies melting together, their hearts beating as one. The kiss that followed was long, tender, filled with a passion that had been tempered by adversity, strengthened by their shared experiences, their unwavering love. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky ablaze with color, a fiery testament to their journey, their resilience, their love. Where the sun set red, a new dawn was waiting, a new beginning, a new life, together. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy, a peaceful contentment that Rosie had never thought possible. She and Landry worked side by side, rebuilding the homestead, restoring it to its former glory, transforming it into a place of warmth, of love, of new beginnings. They planted a garden filled with flowers and vegetables, a symbol of their growing love, their blossoming future. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sunsets, talking, laughing, sharing their dreams, their hopes, their fears. They had been through so much, they had faced so many dangers, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever. But their peace was not to be entirely undisturbed. The past, like a persistent ghost, still lingered, casting a shadow over their newfound happiness. The final confrontation, they knew, was not with guns or outlaws, but with the remnants of their own histories, the scars that needed to heal, the forgiveness that needed to be granted. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Rosie turned to Landry, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. "Landry," she said, her voice soft, hesitant, "there's something I need to ask you. Something I need to know." Landry looked at her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers. He knew what was coming. He had been expecting it, dreading it, but also hoping for it. "Ask me anything, Rosie," he said, his voice gentle, encouraging. Rosie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Regret getting involved with me?" Regret all the danger, all the pain, all the baggage? Landry's eyes softened. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a surge of warmth through her. Never, he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. I never regret meeting you, Rosie. I never regret loving you. You've made my life complete. You've given me something I never thought I deserved. Something I never thought I'd find. Tears welled up in Rosie's eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a love that was overwhelming in its intensity. But I killed a man, Landry, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm a murder. Landry shook his head. You were a survivor, Rosie, he said, his voice filled with compassion. You did what you had to do to protect yourself. You were a victim, not a killer. But Thomas, Rosie continued, her voice choked with emotion. I still feel guilty. I still feel responsible. Thomas made his choices, Rosie, Landry said, his voice firm. He chose a life of crime, a life of violence. He chose to betray you, to use you. You are not responsible for his actions. You are not responsible for his death. He paused, his gaze searching hers, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. We all have ghosts, Rosie, he said, his voice soft. We all have things in our past that we regret, that we wish we could change. But we can't. We can only learn from them, grow from them, and move on. We can only choose to live in the present, to embrace the future, to love with all our hearts. His words resonated deep within Rosie's soul, washing away the guilt, the shame, the self-blame that had haunted her for so long. She had been carrying the burden of the past on her shoulders, allowing it to define her, to limit her. But now, with Landry's love, with his understanding, with his forgiveness, she was finally free. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body trembling with emotion. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, protecting her, comforting her. I love you, Landry, she whispered, her voice filled with a love that was pure, unconditional, unwavering. I love you too, Rosie, he said, his voice choked with emotion. More than words can say. They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the fire crackling softly, the silence filled with a love that had conquered all, a love that had healed all, a love that had brought them home. The final confrontation had been with themselves, with their pasts, and they had emerged victorious, their hearts healed, their horizons clear, their future bright. The vast, starlit sky above them seemed to whisper a blessing, a promise of enduring love and peace. Epilogue. Years passed, like the slow, steady turning of a wagon wheel, leaving behind the deep ruts of hardship and the faint, hopeful tracks of a new beginning. Redemption Gulch, once a ghost town, blossomed under Rosie and Landry's care. The saloon reopened, not as a den of vice, but as a gathering place for the community, filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses celebrating life, not escaping it. The general store's shelves were stocked again, and Martha Jenkins' bakery filled the air with the sweet scent of bread and pies, a testament to resilience and the simple joys of life. Rosie and Landry's homestead became a haven, a place where weary travelers could find rest and kindness, where neighbors gathered for celebrations, and where the echoes of the past were replaced by the sounds of children's laughter. They had adopted 2 orphans, a boy and a girl, siblings who had lost their parents to a fever, giving them a home, a family, a future. Landry hung up his gun belt, not in defeat, but in peace. He had found a different kind of justice, a gentler kind, in building a community, in nurturing a family, in loving Rosie. He became a rancher, tending to the land, raising cattle, his hands, once skilled with weapons, now calloused from honest labor. Rosie, her silver hair now a crown of wisdom and grace, continued to be the heart of their home, her strength and resilience an inspiration to everyone who knew her. She had found peace, not just in the quiet solitude of the prairie, but in the love she shared with Landry, in the laughter of her children, in the warmth of her community. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in a breathtaking tapestry of color, their grandchildren playing at their feet, Landry reached out, and took Rosie's hand. His touch, still strong and gentle, sent a familiar warmth through her. "Remember that first day, Rosie?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "When I rode into town looking for a ghost." Rosie smiled, her eyes sparkling with the memories, with the love that had blossomed in the midst of danger and despair. "I remember," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You found more than a ghost, Landry. You found me." He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze unwavering. "And you, Rosie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You found yourself. You found your strength, your courage, your redemption." They sat there, hand in hand, their silence filled with a love that had endured, a love that had conquered all, a love that had brought them home. The vast, starlit sky above them seemed to whisper a blessing, a promise fulfilled, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the transformative power of love, to the enduring beauty of a life lived fully, honestly, and with a heart full of grace. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, a familiar perfume of the West, a reminder of the journey they had taken, the battles they had fought, the love they had found. And as the stars twinkled above them, like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth, they knew that their story, their love, would live on, a legend whispered on the wind, a testament to the enduring spirit of the West. The end.